The American Civil War tore through the fabric of the United States from 1861 to 1865, leaving an indelible mark on the nation's history. For the soldiers who fought in its battles, the experience was both a crucible and a curse, testing the limits of human endurance and forever altering their lives. Among these soldiers was a young man named Daniel Harper, a farmhand from Pennsylvania, and another named Samuel Reeves, a blacksmith from Georgia. Both men, despite their differing allegiances and reasons for joining the fight, shared the universal soldier's burden, the harrowing experience of life on the battlefield. When the war erupted, many young men were drawn to the fight by a combination of duty, loyalty, and, in some cases, a naive hunger for adventure. Daniel Harper had grown up hearing stories of his grandfather's service in the Revolutionary War. To him, the idea of defending the Union represented not just a duty, but a way to honor his family's legacy. Samuel Reeves, on the other hand, felt the call of Southern pride. He saw himself as defending his home and the traditions his family had lived by for generations. Both men were swept up in the fervor of their respective causes, enlisting within weeks of the first shots being fired at Fort Sumter. Training camps were the first taste of the grim reality that awaited them. Daniel was sent to Camp Curtin, a sprawling and chaotic assembly point in Pennsylvania. He quickly realized that the romantic ideals of war he had harbored were misplaced. The camp was overcrowded, with men from all walks of life crammed together in hastily erected tents. Food was scarce and poorly prepared, and disease ran rampant. The drills, intended to mold the recruits into disciplined soldiers, were grueling and monotonous. For Samuel, stationed at Camp McDonald in Georgia, the experience was no different. The Southern camp suffered from a lack of supplies, and even basic necessities, like shoes and proper clothing, were hard to come by. Yet, the camaraderie that developed among the men offered a small reprieve from the hardships. Both Daniel and Samuel found themselves forging bonds with fellow soldiers that would become as vital to their survival as food and water. When the time came to leave the relative safety of the training camps, the soldiers were transported to the front lines. The first time Daniel marched into battle, he was overwhelmed by the cacophony of war. The thunderous roar of cannons, the deafening crack of rifles, and the screams of the wounded created a nightmarish symphony. He had been issued a rifled musket, but the training he received had not prepared him for the chaos and terror of combat. He quickly learned that survival often depended on instincts he didn't know he possessed. Samuel's first experience of battle was equally disorienting. As his regiment advanced toward Union lines, he was struck by the surreal sight of men falling around him. The air was thick with smoke, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. He fired his weapon almost mechanically, unsure if he had hit anything or anyone. The Confederate officers shouted orders to keep moving, but Samuel's legs felt like lead. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the metallic tang of blood created a stench that would linger in his nostrils long after the fighting had stopped. Life on the battlefield was a relentless cycle of violence, exhaustion, and deprivation. Soldiers on both sides faced long marches that left their feet blistered and swollen. They endured exposure to the elements, with many nights spent sleeping in the open under rain-soaked skies or freezing winds. Food rations were often meager and consisted of hardtack, salted meat, and whatever could be foraged from the surrounding countryside. Hunger was a constant companion, and it was not uncommon for soldiers to scavenge for anything edible, including roots and berries. Disease claimed more lives than bullets or bayonets. Camps and trenches were breeding grounds for illnesses such as dysentery, typhoid, and pneumonia. Medical care was rudimentary at best, and wounded soldiers often faced grim prospects. Amputations were common, performed with little more than a saw and a bottle of whiskey to dull the pain. Daniel witnessed the horrors of field hospitals firsthand, when a fellow soldier in his regiment lost a leg to an infection. The sight of the surgeons, their aprons soaked in blood, haunted him more than the battle itself. Despite the hardships, moments of humanity and camaraderie punctuated the grimness. Daniel found solace in letters from home, though the arrival of mail was sporadic. His mother's words reminded him of the life he had left behind and gave him the strength to persevere. Samuel, too, cherished the letters he received from his wife, Mary, who wrote of their farm and the son he had yet to meet. The shared hardships created an unbreakable bond among the soldiers. Around campfires, they told stories, sang songs, and clung to the small joys that broke the monotony of their grim existence. The seasons changed, and the war dragged on. Daniel found himself fighting at Antietam, a battle that would be remembered as the bloodiest single day in American history. The fields of Maryland were littered with the dead and dying, a grotesque tableau that defied comprehension. Daniel narrowly escaped death when a cannonball struck mere feet from where he stood, showering him with dirt and debris. He emerged from the battle physically unscathed but emotionally scarred, haunted by the faces of his fallen comrades. For Samuel, the turning point came at Gettysburg. The Confederate Army's ambitious push into Union territory ended in a devastating defeat. Samuel was among the thousands who charged across the open field on the third day, an assault that would later be known as Pickett's Charge. As he ran, musket balls and artillery shells tore through the ranks. He was struck in the shoulder and collapsed to the ground, unable to move. The battle raged on around him, and as night fell, he was left on the field among the dead and dying. He was eventually found by Union soldiers and taken as a prisoner of war. The war's final year was marked by desperation and exhaustion. For the Union soldiers, there was the hope that victory was within reach. For the Confederates, each battle felt like a struggle for survival. Daniel marched with General Sherman's army during the infamous March to the Sea, witnessing firsthand the devastation wrought upon the South. Samuel, now recovering in a Union prison camp, grappled with feelings of guilt and helplessness. The war that had once seemed like a noble cause now felt like an endless nightmare. When the war finally ended in 1865, both Daniel and Samuel returned home forever changed. Daniel found his farm in Pennsylvania untouched by the war, but the scars he carried were invisible to the eye. He struggled to reintegrate into civilian life, haunted by memories of the battlefield. Samuel returned to a South that was economically devastated and politically transformed. His blacksmith shop had been destroyed, and his family faced an uncertain future. For both men, the war was a defining chapter in their lives. The camaraderie they had shared with their fellow soldiers was a source of strength, but the memories of suffering and loss lingered like shadows. They were part of a generation that had endured unimaginable hardships, and their experiences would shape the nation's collective memory of the Civil War for years to come. The battlefield had been their crucible, forging them into men who had seen the depths of human suffering and the resilience of the human spirit. Though the war had ended, its echoes would reverberate through their lives and the history of the United States for generations. Expanding this story to a full 10,000 words allows for a more in-depth exploration of the characters, the dynamics of the war, and the broader impact of the Civil War on the lives of its soldiers and their families. Below is a continuation and expansion of the narrative, incorporating additional details, historical context, and emotional depth to the soldiers' experiences. The journey home was fraught with as many challenges as the war itself. For Daniel Harper, the railroads leading back to Pennsylvania were overcrowded with soldiers, refugees, and freedmen, each trying to find their way in a world that had been irrevocably changed. The war had lasted for long years, but to Daniel, it felt like a lifetime. His once strong frame had been reduced to little more than skin and bone, his face hollowed by hunger and exhaustion. The camaraderie he had relied upon during the war dissolved as the soldiers disbanded, each returning to the life they had left behind. For many, including Daniel, This was no joyous homecoming but the beginning of a new and unfamiliar struggle. As he stepped onto the familiar soil of Pennsylvania, the sights and smells of home were almost overwhelming. The fields stretched out in golden waves, untouched by the ravages of war that had scarred so much of the South. Yet, for Daniel, the farm seemed strangely alien. The laughter of his younger siblings, the smell of freshly baked bread wafting from the house, these were things he had longed for during the war, but now they felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else's life. His mother, who had aged considerably since he last saw her, embraced him tightly, but Daniel found it hard to meet her gaze. How could he explain the horrors he had witnessed? The nights spent huddled in freezing trenches, the screams of the wounded, the weight of his rifle as he marched for miles on end, these were things no one at home could truly understand. Samuel Reeves' return to Georgia was even more complicated. The South he had fought to defend lay in ruins. Entire towns had been burned to the ground, plantations abandoned, and the once thriving economy reduced to rubble. Samuel's wife, Mary, and their infant son had managed to survive the war, but the blacksmith shop that had been the foundation of their livelihood was gone. Samuel, still recovering from the wound he had sustained at Gettysburg, was physically unable to work for several months. The Confederate dollar was worthless, and the few coins Mary had saved were barely enough to buy food. The bitterness of defeat hung heavy in the air, and Samuel found himself grappling with feelings of guilt and futility. What had they fought for, if not to preserve their way of life? And what did that way of life mean now, in the ashes of war? The scars of the battlefield were not just physical but emotional. Daniel found himself plagued by nightmares, reliving the horrors of Antietam and the bloody chaos of the wilderness. The smell of gunpowder and the sight of lifeless bodies haunted his dreams, leaving him drenched in sweat and gasping for air. His family tried to help, but they didn't know how. His father, a stern man who had stayed behind to tend the farm, urged him to focus on the work. "The war's over, son," he would say. "Time to put it behind you." But Daniel couldn't. The war was a part of him now, woven into his very being. Samuel's struggles were similar. The wound in his shoulder had healed, but the emotional toll of the war lingered. He avoided the town square, where neighbors gathered to discuss the lost cause and reminisce about better days. He didn't want to talk about the war. He didn't want to think about the friends he had lost or the battles he had fought. He threw himself into rebuilding the blacksmith shop, hammering iron with a fury that startled even Mary. It was the only way he knew how to silence the memories, to keep the darkness at bay. The Reconstruction era brought new challenges for both men. For Daniel, the end of slavery and the beginning of a new union offered hope, but it also revealed the deep divisions that still remained. Pennsylvania was spared the worst of the war's destruction, but tensions ran high as returning soldiers and freedmen sought to carve out new lives. Daniel, who had fought alongside African American soldiers in the Union Army, was sympathetic to their plight. He remembered the courage of men like Corporal Elijah Brown, who had saved his life during a skirmish in Virginia. But not everyone shared his views. Many of his neighbors resented the changes brought by the war, blaming freedmen and abolitionists for the economic challenges they faced. Daniel often found himself caught in the middle, torn between loyalty to his community and a sense of justice he couldn't ignore. Samuel's post-war reality was even more complicated. The South was under military occupation, and the Reconstruction policies implemented by the federal government were deeply unpopular among former Confederates. Samuel wasn't a politician or a landowner, but as a skilled blacksmith, he found himself at the center of the community's struggles. Freedmen came to him seeking tools and equipment to start their own farms, while white neighbors pressured him to refuse service to anyone they deemed unworthy. Samuel tried to stay neutral, focusing on his work and his family, but neutrality was a luxury few could afford in the aftermath of the war. His decision to repair a plow for a freedman named Isaac Johnson sparked outrage among some of his old friends, who accused him of betraying his race. Samuel didn't see it that way. To him, the war had been about defending his home and his family, not upholding a system that had brought so much suffering. As the years passed, both Daniel and Samuel began to find a fragile peace. For Daniel, it came in the form of teaching. He started working at a local school, sharing his knowledge of agriculture and mechanics with the next generation. He found purpose in helping others build a better future, even as he continued to wrestle with the demons of his past. Samuel's peace came from his family. Watching his son grow up in a world that was changing, albeit slowly, gave him hope. He reopened the blacksmith shop and began to rebuild his life, one hammer blow at a time. Despite their different paths, Daniel and Samuel were united by their shared experiences. The war had shaped them in ways they couldn't fully articulate, but it had also taught them the value of resilience, compassion, and hope. They were survivors, and in their own way, they became symbols of a nation striving to heal. The memory of the Civil War never truly faded for either man. On quiet evenings, Daniel would sit on his porch, staring at the stars and wondering about the men he had fought alongside. Were they still alive? Had they found peace? Samuel, too, would think of his comrades, the friends who had fallen at Gettysburg and Chickamauga. He didn't dwell on the politics of the war or the debates about its causes. For him, it was the human cost that mattered, the lives lost, the families broken, the scars left behind. Years later, when Daniel and Samuel were old men, the nation commemorated the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. Veterans from both sides gathered to remember the war and the sacrifices they had made. Daniel and Samuel didn't attend the event, but they read about it in the newspapers. The photographs of grizzled old soldiers shaking hands across the stone walls of Gettysburg stirred something in them. It was a reminder that, despite everything, they had been part of something larger than themselves. The war had divided them, but it had also bound them together as Americans. As they neared the end of their lives, both men found solace in their families and communities. They didn't speak much about the war, but their stories were passed down to their children and grandchildren, becoming part of the fabric of American history. The Civil War was over, but its legacy lived on, in the land, in the people, and in the stories of men like Daniel Harper and Samuel Reeves, who had endured its harrowing trials and emerged forever changed.